Hello, everyone. To make sure that the podcast remains a safe space for everyone, I wanted to pop in first to let you know that there is discussion around suicide in this episode. Hello, I'm Dr Jodi Richardson, and you're listening to, well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. How gorgeous is the feeling of safety? Being in a safe space, being with safe people, and being in a safe environment. We don't realise how lucky we are until we're outside of that safe space, at which point we absolutely crave it. How often and for how long do autistic children feel safe on a day-to-day basis? The reality is, so many autistic people do not feel safe. They, of course, feel anxious. I've started today's episode by quoting today's guest. He's joining the podcast today to help us understand anxiety in autistic children and teens and how parents and teachers can help. Dr Luke Beardon is a senior lecturer in the Autism Centre at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. He's been working as a practitioner, providing support and consultancy in the field of autism and Asperger's syndrome for over 20 years. Voted by students, Dr. Beardon is the recipient of both the Inspirational Teacher Award and the Inspirational Researcher Award, and you will see why very soon. He is the author of multiple titles, and he has an inclusive, positive approach to helping autistic people thrive in a neurotypical world, celebrating strengths, as well as acknowledging difficulties. So, Dr. Luke Beardon, thank you for your time today.
You're more than welcome, Jodi. Listening to that, I was thinking, I want to meet this guy. Sounds like he might have something sensible to say as opposed to myself.
Yes, it's often a little bit strange, isn't it, hearing your biography read in this way, and it's a really nice summary of, and it is only a summary, it's only a snapshot of the wonderful work that you do, and I thank you for sharing your time, because I know you mentioned that you have another book deadline, you're writing another book, and so again, thank you for your time today. Could you please start by talking to us about how entwined autism and anxiety are or are not?
Do you know what? That's probably one of the best questions to open a discussion like this, because it's a multiple answer in a sense. So on the one hand, I think I could categorically claim that autism does not equate to anxiety per se. But bear with me before you switch off. On the other hand, I could also categorically claim that anxiety is rife amongst autistic people. So trying to link those statements together, I think even at this early stage, I'll shoehorn my self-professed golden equation in, that autism plus environment equals outcome, not autism on its own. So being autistic does not automatically or intuitively or neurologically necessarily lead to anxiety. Otherwise, all autistic people would be anxious all of the time, and that's not the case. However, we do know that so many autistic children and adults are autistic much of the time. So the question then is, why is that the case? And I've always thought very strongly that it's the environment that causes the anxiety, the combination of the individual and the environmental context that that individual finds themselves in. So if you go back to that golden equation, autism plus environment equals outcome, if the outcome is anxiety, and if we accept that within that equation we can't change somebody being autistic, which we can't, and nor should we want to, then the only thing left to change is the environment. And unfortunately, I find that so often the onus is on the individual to change rather than the environment. So it's so the spotlight is very often on the autistic child to fit in, to mask, to camouflage, to cope, all of those terms, which actually can be horrifically damaging to the autistic child.
I can completely understand why that would be the case. And it brings me, I guess, to the question, my next question, which would be for those listeners. So there'll be listeners to this episode who will be parents who have autistic children and know autism well. There will be teachers who are well trained and understand what it's like to be teaching an autistic child. But for the rest of the population, or teachers or parents who are new to this journey, or to people like me who don't have an autistic child but really want to understand more, could you explain, please, to us about autism and the way that it exists on a spectrum?
Well, first of all, going backwards, I would, in a sense, encourage people, whether this sounds controversial or not, I don't know, but I would encourage people to not think about autism in terms of a spectrum. And I'm perhaps one of the few people in the world that would say that. The reason being is that there's long since been this concept of a spectrum. It came out back in the 80s, and originally it was developed to kind of identify the heterogeneity of the population, so the individuality of the population. So Lorna Wing, I think, was the first person really to talk about the autism spectrum around this diverse population, which is great. Unfortunately, I think since then, it's been, in a sense, misunderstood or reframed to almost be like this kind of linear line, if you like, with sort of severe autism at one end or low functioning autism, and then mild autism or whatever at the other end. And that's when it becomes unbelievably damaging. My view is you're either autistic or you're not. Categorically, you can't be a bit autistic, and that's one of the things that causes lots of autistic people anxiety, those sorts of notions. The other thing that the concept of a spectrum does is it actually encourages these functioning labels. So to say to somebody, oh, you're high functioning or you're low functioning, doesn't give a complete picture of an individual at all. It really, really doesn't. And it goes back to this concept of autism plus environment equals outcome. You can be the most high functioning person in the universe if your environment suits you. If the environment is antithetical to what your needs are, you could be incredibly low functioning, and you're the same human being. So to brand people with those labels, I think, is extraordinarily unhelpful, and it changes expectations of other people, perhaps unfairly so. So, for example, I know autistic children who are pre-verbal and labelled as low functioning, who are 18, suddenly start reading and writing and end up going to university. And then you know other people who often are labelled as high functioning, and they're the ones who tragically end up taking their own lives. So you think, well, if that sort of those functioning labels lean towards, oh, you're only mild, and then you take into account those are the individuals who are so desperately troubled by their self and their environment that they end up wanting to commit suicide, then you sort of think, I'm not sure it's that mild then. So I think you're much better off, or we are much better off, understanding the individual as the individual at that moment in time. And that will change from one environment to the next, from one day to the next, from 1 week to the next, and so on. So that's the easy bit. Going to the more difficult bit in terms of what is autism, what I would suggest, again, and your listeners can make up their own minds, they don't need me to tell them, but my belief is society as a whole, global society, internationally, we're getting it wrong in terms of what we're told autism is. The diagnostic criteria, he says, trying to sort of even suggests, so manuals such as ICD-10 and DSM-5 have a very medical model approach to what autism is. So it's known as a deficit. It's known as a disorder. Individuals are known to have impairments, and I reject that model entirely. I think it's a bit like trying to compare a dog to a cat and claiming that a dog is an impaired cat or a cat is an impaired dog. No, a cat makes a great cat and a rubbish dog. A dog makes a great dog and a rubbish cat. And I think autistic people make brilliant autistic people and not very good non-autistic people, in the same way that non-autistic people make rubbish autistic people. So this sort of comparison model, I think we've got to reject. And I genuinely mean that, because it only adds to autistic people's anxiety. Imagine that you are faced on a day-to-day basis with this rhetoric, this narrative that you're lesser, of a human being, that you're impaired, you're not
Yeah.
as good as, etc., etc., etc. And I think almost subconsciously that's what society does. Even if you go online and look at the narratives that surrounds autism, it's surrounded by extraordinarily ableist, pejorative language. And if you're faced with that on a day-to-day basis, you will grow up with feelings of low self-worth, low self-esteem, and that will only add to your anxiety. So I think on a global level, we have to change the international narrative around what autism actually is. My view is it's a qualitatively different way of processing information, and that includes sensory information. In a sense, it's as simple as that. And it's interesting what you were saying about, if you're a parent of an autistic child, you've got a great understanding of your child. If you're a teacher, you've got a great understanding of teaching. And I'm sure that's absolutely true. But what you don't necessarily have is a great understanding of the lived experience of what it actually means to be autistic. And I think
Mm.
this whole thing about empathy is an interesting one. We're told, aren't we, or it's inferred, that autistic people lack empathy, which is rubbish, by the way. Lots of autistic people have extraordinary amounts of empathy, even hyper empathy, which is so overwhelming. That's when they shut down, which is why then on the surface, the presentation is, oh, you must lack empathy. Actually, that individual is so overwhelmed with empathy for their dog or their cat or their goose or their parent or their sibling or their friend at school, they literally can't express it. I think there's a distinct lack of empathy from the non-autistic population for what it's like to be autistic, which is totally understandable. So the better we understand and live and listen to the lived experience of autistic people and take it incredibly seriously, the better the prospects are for those autistic children.
What can we do to help change the narrative around autism? Because it sounds like there's a long way to go based on what the general beliefs are in the population. So, what can listeners to this podcast do to help make a difference in that way?
Jodi, that's just a gorgeous question, because it's so easy to answer. Just change the narrative. Stop talking about disorder. Take down the posters at school that are headed autism spectrum disorder and replace it with the word autism. It's as simple as that. And challenge people. You know, if you're a parent and someone says, and you say, oh yeah, my child's autistic. Oh, that means they're not very good at X, Y, and Z. Say, well, where did you get that information from? Actually, that's not necessarily the case. If you say autistic people are poor at communication, communication by definition is a two-way street. So whose issue is it? Is it everybody's issue? Why is it the sole responsibility of the autistic person? And actually, some autistic people are extraordinarily good communicators, much, much better than what I refer to as the predominant neurotype. And that's where the problem arises, because if there's a mismatch in communication, there's misunderstanding. If there's misunderstanding, somebody gets the blame. And that's what frustrates me, because it always seems to be the poor autistic person that gets the blame. For example, just a quick example in the diagnostic criteria, it even says things along that I'm not necessarily quoting verbatim, although I might be. Autistic people are impaired in communication, for example, have a literal interpretation of language. They're just linguistically accurate, and the predominant neurotype are not. So I just think, hang on a minute, who's the one with the impairment then? This superb quality of linguistic accuracy and attention to detail, these wonderful characteristics, and yet they're the ones that are still being painted as the ones with an impairment. It's just not fair.
It doesn't make sense. And the points that you're making are so powerful. And I love that. See, that speaks to my misunderstanding when I asked that initial question about the spectrum. And so it's going to take time, isn't it, for people to learn more about it, basically, to understand it. And conversations like this are so important. And again, just I love your advocacy, I love your passion, and I love your expertise, and appreciate you sharing it with us here today, because we're all, no matter who's listening, we're all learning.
I think that does lead on to a really well, I say interesting point. Your listeners can make up their own minds. But the whole concept of trust, if you're an autistic person and you lack trust in the world because of the narrative around you as a human being, where do you go to turn to? Where's your rock? Where's your, going back to what you were saying earlier, where's your safety? Living without safety, living without having faith or trust in the world is terrifying. Whereas if we do start changing the narrative, listening more to autistic people, there's going to be a growing level of trust from those individuals and therefore a growing level of safety. So I think anxiety, going back to the nature of your podcast, it's too easy to think about triggers for anxiety, things that cause autistic children anxiety, and then sort those out. But actually, a much bigger problem, in my view anyway, is this ongoing level of distress that's very often hidden on a day-to-day basis. That's what's absolutely destroying in terms of well-being. It's very difficult to have good well-being when you're in a constant state of distress or anxiety. And of course, some autistic people won't know that that isn't the same for everybody else. How do you know you're colorblind? How do you know what other people's state of being is? So many people I talk to, when we start talking about emotional states and anxiety in particular, are genuinely bewildered and perplexed and saying things like, well, isn't it like that for everyone? It's like, no, it's not. Isn't that a usual state of being? No, it's not. And then the next question is, well, do I have to be like this then? And the answer is no, you don't. That is not how people should be. And then it goes on to, well, why am I like this? And then it goes down to all of those things that are essentially against you in life that cause maybe sometimes low level of anxiety, but those low levels of anxiety multiply and multiply and multiply because you're facing them every minute of every day when you get out of bed. And that might sound like hyperbole, but actually for a lot of autistic children, it's not. And those sorts of levels of anxiety in childhood have potentially dire repercussions for adulthood. So I genuinely believe that exposure to ongoing anxiety increases risk of leading to complex post-traumatic stress disorder as an adult, which is very, very difficult to live with. And I think sometimes within children's services, education, for example, we're quite remiss at looking to the future and thinking these children go into adults and they're adults, excuse me, they're adults for a lot longer than they are children. And actually, this is why, going back to your question around changing the narrative, this is just a little one. It's one of my sort of pet hates in a sense. You go into a school and somebody says, oh yeah, Sarah's, she's doing really well. She's coping fantastically. And I think, why is she having to cope? If she's having to cope, then we're getting something wrong. Why should it be down to her to develop coping strategies? She should be a happy autistic child without having to cope with facing this mainstream education. If there's coping strategies, she must be going through something problematic in the first place. And I just think we can't underestimate the level of distress that even seemingly innocuous, trivial things, such as here's something for you. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but there's two. I like things in sets of threes, but there's two things that really stand out for me in education that we can change. One is the noise of the school bell. If you're sensory hypersensitive, the noise of the school bell can be terrifying. If you have what's called synesthesia and you respond to noise as pain, which plenty of autistic people do, and school bells can be horrific. So if you're exposed to pain, 9, 10, 11, 12 times a day, and you know that's what you're going to face every time you go to school, and actually it'd be quite easy for us to remove the school bell and change it for something else. We could do that without costing any money at all. And all of a sudden, you're decreasing the risk of autistic people being in pain every single day. Similarly, what I call the corridor crush, that transition between lessons. Again, if you're hypersensitive to touch and you're tactile defensive and somebody brushing past you feels like you're being beaten up, Again, just say, okay, we'll have quiet transition times, 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after. And all of a sudden, you're reducing risk of exposure of those children being genuinely traumatized every time they have to transition between lessons. And all of a sudden, you've got an individual who no longer has complex post-traumatic stress as an adult just by doing those little things.
And those little things, like you were saying with the anxiety, that anxiety is the anticipation of what might happen. And so there's that definite knowledge the bell is going to ring at the start of school, at the end of, the start of recess, at the end of recess, et cetera, et cetera. And that those experiences, they're cumulative, aren't they?
Absolutely. So, and I think this is where empathy does come in, because you explain that to a non-autistic person and then just say, imagine every single day when you first wake up, you're going to be exposed to that. And then people start thinking, God, that would be horrific. And then you say, you try and explain to your parents, oh, I'm stressed. And your parent says, don't worry, you'll be fine. And again, you get home that night and think, my parents have lied to me yet again. They say it to me every single
Yes.
morning and every single night. I think I'm supposed to trust you. Where do I go? Where does my voice get heard? Because this is a genuine concern for me. And I think the other thing to maybe investigate, I'd be really interested to hear other people's views on this. But it's what I refer to as autistic anxiety, and I'm absolutely categorically not suggesting that being anxious is a sole domain of autistic people. Nor do I necessarily think that the actual feeling in terms of emotional state of being anxious is felt in any different way. But I think the concept of autistic anxiety, so the duration of that anxiety, the level of that anxiety, and then what I call maybe the anxiety hangover, are actually different experiences. So if we if you say to a non-autistic group of individuals, when was the last time you were anxious, as in you woke up or you were consciously aware, your brain was actually telling you, I am stressed, they're very few and far between for most non-autistic people. Whereas you ask a group of autistic people and they'll look puzzled and it's like, well, every day I'm consciously aware that I'm anxious every single day. So even that in and of itself is so qualitatively different to the predominant neurotype. And then you say to the non-autistic person, okay, well, what makes you anxious? What has made you anxious in the past? They might say, for example, a job interview. Take that as an example. You say, okay, well, usually the pattern of your anxiety is that you start getting anxious as time goes towards your interview. And maybe a day before or a couple of days, you have those elevated levels of anxiety that you're aware of. On the day of the interview, you really feel it. Half an hour before, and the peak is usually when you go into the interview or 5 minutes into the interview. You have your interview, it lasts 20 minutes or an hour or whatever. And then remarkably, almost as soon as you leave, your anxiety dissipates very, very quickly. Now, for the autistic person, it might not be an interview, it might be going to a child's birthday party or whatever it might be that causes their anxiety. That anxiety might start from the minute they know they're going to that party, and that's 3 weeks before. And then the level of anxiety is way, way high. And then they've got anxiety for 3 weeks afterwards as well. So what might be the case for a non-autistic person being anxious for 3 days, all of a sudden you've got 6 weeks worth of anxiety for the autistic child. And I genuinely think that's a common pattern.
And it makes me wonder whether or not there's much time at all without high anxiety for autistic people who are struggling, because if it's not one thing, it's another. There must be overlap of various triggers that cause the anxiety. And if one event is going to elevate the anxiety for 3 weeks in advance and 3 weeks post, I worry that there will be large stretches of time where there's almost this chronic anxiety.
Absolutely. And I think there's those things that, as you say, cause those triggers going to a child's birthday party. I wrote about this in one of my books, in terms of the child's main anxiety was, well, what do I buy as a present? And when I take the present to the child's house, what do I do with it? Those unknowns are terrifying. Most non-autistic people don't have them, or they will have them on rare occasions where you literally just think, what is going on? What do I do? I'm in that, I'm nonplussed. I'm literally on the spot, in the spotlight, or that's how I feel. and I don't know what to do. And that's really, really stressful. Something as innocuous as going to a birthday party and thinking, I've got this present, I've turned out, do I shove it in the guy's face as soon as they open the door? Well, it's not him that opens the door. So now what do I do with it? Do I go and hide it in his bedroom? What do I do with, and that's just one case of, almost an infinite number of, as I say, seemingly innocuous things that might cause distress to an autistic person because they don't have the capacity to learn from their non-autistic peers in the same way that the predominant neurotype do. So a lot of that inherent knowledge is just subsumed in the non-autistic brain, whereas loads of other types of knowledge are subsumed into the autistic brain, which is of equal value, it should be of equal value. But without recognizing some of those things that might cause distress, the poor autistic child just has to put up with it. And of course, they don't necessarily know then where to find help. That's one of the things that parents can do, is habitually make themselves or expose themselves to what causes issues for their child. So I love things like, I like lists anyway, but just something as simple as saying to an autistic child who's able to communicate in that sense, just habitually make a list every day of 3 things. What's the best thing that's happened to you today? What's the worst thing that's happened to you today? If you could change something from today, what would it be? And you don't have to tell me. You can write it down. You can put it on your iPad. You could email me. You can make a little screencast. You can do a YouTube, whatever you want. All of a sudden, you've got an enormous wealth of information that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily have had. Because otherwise what we classically do as parents, your child gets home from school, how was school? Grunt, off they go. Because that face-to-face communication with a parent, as an autistic child, where you're in a high level of anxiety anyway, because you've just had to manage a day of school, the last thing you want is more face-to-face communication while you're on the spot. That doesn't mean to say you don't want to communicate your anxiety. So there are little things that we can do that can make an enormous difference, a huge difference in terms of information gathering from those children. But the other thing that I wanted to say is my concept of global stability. So this is a hypothesis of mine, but talking to hundreds of autistic people seems to make sense. So I think the predominant neurotype are globally stable in the main. I'm not saying everybody is. And certainly, obviously, you're the expert in terms of your podcast. So maybe you're the wrong person to be talking to. But on average, the average predominant neurotype person is globally stable, i.e. on a day-to-day basis, they're not in a high level of distress or anxiety. And I think it's often the opposite, as we've been saying, for autistic children and adults. So the question is, why might that be the case? And I like to flip it around and say, okay, well, what causes that stability for the non-autistic population? And I think it's things as simple, in inverted commas, as how easy do you find to communicate with people around you? When was the last time you were thinking, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. I don't know who to say it to. I don't understand what that person means. How easy is it for you to engage in your peer sociality? So again, when was the last time you were in a social situation thinking, I have no clue what it is that I'm doing here? How easy is it for you to be in the sensory environment? Again, when was the last time you were in a sensory environment thinking, I'm in pain here, or I'm in distress here because of the lighting or the noise of the ticking clock, or the fact that the child next to me is tapping her fingernails on the desk, or whatever it might be? And the list could go on and on and on. And for all of those reasons, the predominant neurotype tend to be very stable. You flip it over and ask those very same questions on behalf of your autistic child. And then you soon begin to realize, okay, my child is not going to be globally stable. And that's why I think children love their routines, because they're in their control. They're the same every time. And that's why if you break a child's routine, then literally all hell breaks loose. Not because necessarily that child it's what we call resistance to change as well. And I refute that. Autistic people are not resistant to change. They're resistant to certain things being changed. You can change all sorts of things in the autistic person's life and they couldn't care less. But if you try and change their routine, that becomes problematic. So, and my view is that's because that routine is where the child gets their stability from. So if 90% of their life is unstable, but 10% of it is extraordinarily stable because it's their routine. You change that 10%, and it's the same as changing somebody else's 90%. And again, what we then do is say, well, you can't do your routines all the time, or things do change, so you need to get used to that. And we can't always take the same route to school. We can't always eat out of the same bowl, etc., etc., etc. And the focus and the spotlight is on those flashpoints. Forget about those and look at everything else and say, how can we make my child? How can we make me? How can we make my husband? How can we make my aunt or whatever more stable on a day-to-day basis? Then all of a sudden, your reliance on those other areas of stability go down because they're not as important. And that's all about how can you make that autistic person feel safe? How can we communicate where we're not providing falsehoods? How can we create a stable sensory environment with lovely fidget toys left, right, and centre, and hammocks in the garden, and etc., etc., etc. And if we increase the global stability of an individual, then all of a sudden they're going to start feeling so much safer.
And parents can take the cues from the 3 questions in the day, the what went well, what didn't go so well, what would you love to change? Because that's just such an insight, as you said, and that enables a parent to have the window into what could make quite a meaningful difference if little things start to improve over time.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, of course, to mention is alexithymia, where an individual might struggle to recognise either their own emotional states or label their own emotional states or other people's emotional states as well. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that means that autistic people lack emotion. That's complete rubbish. But if you ask a child, so again, it's a common mistake, lovely, well-meaning, gorgeous parents is, well, how did you feel at school today? If that's a question that's impossible to answer, you're either going to get a false answer, or you're going to get a meltdown, or you're going to get a distrusting autistic child. And I love the concept of developing meaningful communication on a one-to-one basis. So if we accept that we need to start from the start and make the assumption that actually emotional language can mean something different to one person to the next. So if I was to say to
Yes.
you, oh, does that give you joy? You might say yes or no. If you were to reverse the question and ask me, my concept of joy might be different to yours. So when I say, oh, I'm feeling joyful today, you might think, oh, I know what that feels. It might be completely different. Whereas if we say, okay, how do we feel today? And we have the most neutral day in the universe. So how does and we'll give neutrality a label. And going back to the concept of a spectrum, this is where it is helpful. And we'll call that 0. So that's point 0. And we'll call that emotional state ambivalent. Okay. So if I say to you, how was school today? Say, I'm ambivalent. I'll know then what that actually means. And then the next day we say, well, was today better or worse than yesterday? How much so on a scale between 1 and 9? 9 being, your worst day ever so far. And then we'll call that crisis. I've had a crisis today, or high state of distress, or whatever. All the way up to +9, which is joy, or ecstasy, or whatever it might be. If we learn those emotional terms together, they become meaningful. And it gives the child the voice, a meaningful voice, and it gives the parent or teacher or whoever a meaningful understanding of that child's voice.
Can the same thing be done with sensory stimulation for a autistic child to be able to convey where they find that their threshold is when it comes to light or sound or touch?
Again, it's one of those things that very similar to, sorry to repeat myself, but if you're colorblind, how do you know it's any different to anybody else? And that's very,
Yes.
very much the case for the sensory environment. And
Yes.
I'm obsessed with all things autistic, particularly obsessed with the sensory side of things, partly because changing the sensory environment on behalf of the child can be so beneficial without any spotlight on the child whatsoever. And also working with adults. And sometimes it's very difficult, actually, for adults when they discover that journey of self-discovery of their own sensory side of things and realizing that it's not the case for everybody to be in constant pain because of the feeling of the label against their neck or whatever it might be, or seams in socks. That's another one. It's like, why? Oh, I love the fact, seams in socks is a classic. Turn them inside out, job done. Or you can buy seamless socks. It's just a tiny little hack that all of a sudden makes a difference between a child being uncomfortable and unable to learn at school and being a happy student. So that's another thing that I get really worried about is when you have schools who are particularly dictatorial about school uniform. Everybody's got to have exactly the same school uniform. Yeah, but what if wearing a tie makes my child feel like they're being strangled all day, every day? Or you've got to have your top button done up. Yeah, but that means I can't breathe. I actually can't breathe. You've got to eat your dinner in the canteen. Well, you're making me starve then, because I can't cope with the sound of people masticating a foot away from me, or whatever it might be. So it's very, very serious. The flip side being, if we get it right, and I think all autistic people, whatever age, should have a clear sensory profile that is updated from one environment to the next. And we need to be auditing the sensory environment to make sure that risk of discrimination against that child or adult is reduced or eliminated as much as possible. It's easier said than done. I don't know of any. I mean, that occupational therapy are brilliant often in terms of developing those sensory profiles, and some people have tried. I once tried to do a PhD on developing a system for sensory profiles, but I gave up. Somebody else much cleverer than me might be able to do it, but I got to a point where I thought it's impossible to do on an individual basis. It's impossible to develop a system that is so individual that tells you my child can't bear the sound of a chihuahua barking as opposed to a German Shepherd or whatever it might, because that's how individual sensory profiles are. So I
Yes.
thought, actually, but that doesn't mean to say we can't, or we shouldn't be striving towards doing that and having a better understanding of what a sensory profile might look like. In terms of your 5 primary senses, and then your vestibular sensory system, your proprioception and your interoception. So interoception, again, doesn't get a look in. How do we know if our child knows whether they're hungry or not? Etc., etc., etc. As long as we're then consciously aware of those things, we can potentially take them into account. That's probably another whole different podcast in its own right. But yeah, I love the whole sensory side of stuff.
Oh, I do too. I'm fascinated, and I think for our listeners, when we talk about the 5 main senses, the ones that we all sort of learn early, then you talked about the vestibular system, proprioception, and interoception. I wonder if you could spend a moment on each of those, just for listeners who are not familiar with those senses.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, well, I say, of course. Can I do it within a few minutes? We'll have to wait. Okay, so very, very simply then, vestibular is balance. So that's the simplest way of putting it. And you can have hyper or hyposensitivity, sensitive. You can be hyper or hyposensitive to vestibular functioning. Anybody can, but it's much more common in autistic children. And the more common side is hypo, so being undersensitive to vestibular functioning, which means you love movement in order to feel balanced. So when you've got a child who's rocking in a lovely, gleeful way, it makes them feel physically. I was going to say it makes them feel physically stable. It's very true for some people, but you can't always assume that's the reason why somebody's rocking. Same with stimming and those sorts of lovely rhythmical movements, which is why the access to things like hammocks, trampolines, roundabouts, all those gorgeous stimmy vestibular movements that can massively reduce anxiety and provide that feeling of safety. They should be everywhere. They should be, and accessible for autistic people. Proprioception is more to do with fine motor coordination, the position of your body in relation to your own self, other people, your environment. I maintain that if an autistic child has difficulty, for example, with writing, then we should encourage typing instead. Writing in this day and age is less of a skill that's required compared to typing. And if it's actually painful to write, and then the outcome is practically illegible anyway, is it fair to force that child into that situation over and over again? Whereas actually touch typing, they may be perfectly able to do, and all of a sudden that problem at school disappears.
Yeah.
And again, it's those sorts of things that can cause either trauma for the child or an education, and literally one or the other. And then where were we? And then interoception is your understanding of the inner workings of your body, your heart rate, and things, temperature control to a certain degree, and then things like feeling hungry, thirsty, tired, all of those sorts of things. So again, all three of those are just as important as your 5 primary senses, 100%.
Thank you. Oh, you did so well. You did so well. You managed to give us a really concise summary, and I appreciate that. Because I have one last question before we finish up. And the question is, parents and teachers listening today will have learned so much from your expertise. But one of the questions that I know that I get asked if I'm out presenting and I'm speaking to parents about anxiety and how to understand it, what it's like, what to look for, how to recognize it, and how to help their children to learn to manage it, to dial it back. That one of the questions I get is from parents more and more frequently is, my child's autistic. Is there a difference in how I can support them compared to how other parents here are going to be supporting their own children? What would your answer to that question be?
Gorgeous ending questions. Oh, so you opened with a brilliant one, you end with a brilliant one. I was going to say this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's not. If you find yourself doing things in a way that suits most children, you're probably getting it wrong. If you're doing something unusual for your autistic child, then you've got a better chance of getting it right, because your child is different. That's the whole point. If your child is not
Yeah.
part of the demographic norm, which being autistic by definition is being outside of that demographic norm, then it stands to reason that what works for most people might need to be different for your autistic child. It's one of my, so I've mentioned my golden equation. I'll just quickly mention the other two, because as I say, I like things in
Yes,
sets of three.
please.
So
Yes.
the golden nugget, there's a golden nugget and golden concept. The golden nugget being everything needs translating. And by everything, I mean everything: communication, systems, policies, how we engage with an individual, how we go about reducing anxiety, potentially needs translating from how we do it with the predominant neurotype group of individuals and your autistic child. So everything you need to bear in mind, how does this need translating to suit the needs of my autistic child? And then lastly, and this I don't mean to sound defeatist in any way, shape or form, but the amount of energy you put in to trying to affect change has got to be worth the intended outcome. I think as parents, we take on battle after battle after battle after battle after battle. And then in hindsight, we think, was it really worth it? Actually, maybe we'd have been better off doing something else, because that small, tiny
Mm.
incremental change where we won that battle in the great scheme of things, sometimes it's not worth it. And actually, even outside of a parental perspective, the example that I frequently give is that poor autistic child, where school put in 2 terms worth of effort to get them to accept going to assembly. And then you think,
Yes.
was it worth it? Does that child get anything out of that anyway? Really, what was the point? We would have
Mm.
been much better off just creating a nice, safe environment and then live streaming assembly via their laptop. There you go.
Yes, pick your battles. It sounds like is a nice summary. I have one more question, if you don't mind, that I can't, based on what you just shared with us. An example of something that's very powerful for reducing the experience of anxiety is breath work. And one of the things that I talk about often is lengthening the exhalation, because this through the vagus nerve can help reduce the heart rate and settle the nervous system and bring the parasympathetic nervous system online. Not telling you anything you don't already know, but with that as an example, for a parent, teacher, or anybody here who's listening who is autistic that might want to adopt that strategy, you were saying that if it's something that is working for most, that neurotypical people, then it may not be the right fit. How could you play around with a strategy like that, knowing how powerful it can be for sort of bringing that parasympathetic rest and digest part of the nervous system back online?
Well, I think you said it yourself. You play around with it. A lot of the stuff that ties in with the sensory side of things, including controlled breathing and self-regulation, the whole thing about self-regulation. First of all, it relies on having a sense of self and knowing where you're at from a sensory perspective in the first place. So having that understanding around what might be required in terms of self-regulation. And then a lot of it, I have to say, is trial and error for the individual or for the child or for the parents, what works in what circumstance, what doesn't work. So sometimes, for example, I know this is going beyond the realm of breathing, but say, for example, the auditory environment, it's so common for non-autistic people to say, oh, let's put relaxing music on. And you've got the autistic child. It's like, no, thrash metal is my relaxing music. Actually, you might hate it, but for me, that's what deregulates. That's what de-stresses me. That's what regulates me. So each to their own, 100%. And a lot of it is trial and error. But actually, in terms of the breathing, that's one of the things that often doesn't need translating, because it does work incredibly effectively for many autistic people. So, but I love that concept of self-regulation and allowing autistic people the time and space, and the safe time and space, to be able to self-regulate when it suits them.
What a beautiful place to finish. You are an absolute joy to listen to, Luke. I've genuinely been so captivated by your explanations, the way that you can help us as neurotypical people to learn more about autism and to understand the relationship between autism and anxiety. And it's complex. It's more complex than listeners might have predicted when they first tuned in. And you've done a really beautiful job of helping us to see the nuances and to get a better understanding of how we can not only work with parents of autistic children or with children ourselves, depending on what listeners will be doing professionally, but also you've helped us to learn more how we can help change the narrative, which I think is equally as powerful as anything else that we've discussed. So I'm very grateful for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And how can people connect with you and your work? I know that your books, you are a prolific author, and the books are available online. And I'm going to put links to the books that you've written in the show notes. And also you mentioned that if people wanted to reach out, you'd be happy for them to reach out via email.
Yeah, I think I'm relatively easy to find. I haven't got a magic wand, so bear that in mind if you do email me. And I live quite a long way away, so I can't rock up on your doorstep to help out. But if anybody does want to reach out and have a chat via email, then yeah, feel free.
That's very kind, very generous. And I'll pop the email address in the show notes as well. Luke, thank you again for your time. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for this very special conversation. And I hope that you will share it with anybody in your circle, in your community, who you think might benefit from it. Thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next week. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr Jodi Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.